We're outside, we're down by this beautiful lake to bring you my top 10 photography tips to help you improve your photography, to take your photography to the next level. I'm Ray Scott, and welcome to Visual Art Photography Tutorials. Well, as I said, it's a perfect spring morning. What a great day to talk about my top 10 tips for photography. We start off with one that, honestly, it makes a lot of photographers' eyes roll because they just don't want to deal with it. But you know something, we have to if we want to get our photography to the next level. So the number one tip is know your camera. Now, if you're buying into a brand new system or you're buying your first DSLR, it really is a good idea to open that manual with your camera, battery fully charged, and go through some of the things to help you understand what your camera is all about. Now, if you're buying a new camera in the same system, say for me, Canon, and I buy a new camera, well, I know already how the camera system works. There's not too much difference from camera to camera. However, there may be some new features, so I always sit down with my camera and my manual and I go through it to make sure I know everything that my camera can do. Because if you don't know what your camera can do, you may be missing out on a lot of things. So get to know your camera. That's tip number one. Now, tip number two. This is a really important one. In fact, it's so important that in the very near future, I'm going to do a tutorial dedicated to this. And it's number two is know what shutter, aperture, and ISO are. It's really important. You have to know exactly what your shutter is, what it can do, what the aperture does, and what the ISO does. And they're all related. They all work together. So you have to know what they can do individually, and you have to know how they relate to each other and how they can work together. That's tip number two. Tip number three, it's a little bit different. Look at what other photographers do. Look at their work. Why? Well, it's not to compare your photography with theirs. It's not about that. It's about getting different ideas. And I don't mean that you should be copying what somebody else does. That's the last thing you should be doing. But sometimes when you look at somebody else's work, you get inspired and you get new ideas that send you off in different directions. It's always a great idea to know what's going on around you, in anything, especially in photography. Tip number three, look at what other photographers do. Tip number four, you know, we have these wonderful cameras and we tend to want to rush through things a lot. Slow down. Slow the whole process down. When you have your camera up in front of your eye, you're looking through the viewfinder, or if you're looking at the LCD display, make sure you're looking at everything. Make sure you're looking at the corners so that things aren't creeping in that you don't want there. Slow down. If you can't slow down that way, put your camera on a tripod. It's a great way to slow down. A tripod will make things really slow. It's great, especially for landscape photographers, or obviously if you're doing night photography, anything like that. But using a tripod is a great way to make sure that you get your images exactly the way you want them. But even if you don't use a tripod, try to slow down and try to make sure that you're looking at everything in the viewfinder, that you're looking at everything on the LCD screen, just to double check. Tip number five, shoot raw. Now, there's nothing wrong with a JPEG image. They're great. The problem there is that your camera is doing all the processing for you. Now, if you shoot raw, you're getting the raw image, and the only processing that's going on in the camera is getting you the actual raw image. That's it. Everything else is up to you. So if you shoot in RAW, you have complete control over what your image is going to look like. And isn't that what you want in the end? Complete control over your photography. So shoot RAW. That's tip number 5. Now tip number 6. How often have you seen shots and they always appear to be taken from the same height? Either the height of a tripod or the height of somebody standing up. Well, that's okay. But what about using different angles? How about getting down on the ground really low, especially if you're shooting kids? If you're shooting children, you've got to be at their level. That's what you have to do. You have to get down on the ground with them, get down on the floor with them. But even if you're out there shooting landscapes, what about getting a little bit high, shooting from the top of a hill or a rise, or getting down low on the ground and shooting up, getting different angles? It adds a whole different dynamic to your photography. So that's tip number 6, shoot from different angles. Number 7, shoot in the sweet light, what we like to call the sweet light, which is basically a half an hour before sunrise and then an hour or an hour and a half after sunrise, and then late afternoon before sunset and about a half hour after sunset. The light is just so warm, and not to mention that because the sun is lower in the sky, you have these tremendous shadows that make your photography much more dynamic, and it gives it all kinds of different contrasting effects and things like that. So shoot in the sweet light. I mean, not to say you shouldn't shoot in the middle of the day either, especially if you're shooting black and white, or maybe you're doing some infrared photography, something like that. But generally, if you really want the warm tones and you want the long shadows, early in the day, later in the afternoon, and into the evening. That's tip number 7, shoot in the sweet light. Tip number 8, shoot in different weather. Now, a lot of us don't like to get out in the snow and in the rain, but you know something? You can get some great images when it's raining outside. You know, the puddles, the reflections, the wet streets, all that kind of thing. Or, you know, plants, you have all these beautiful drops on them, and it may be even fog, and all kinds of different weather is great for photography. And even better than that is shooting what I call on the edge of things. In other words, you've got a pretty good day going, let's say, but there's a storm coming in. Well, you know, when a storm comes in, it can be very, very dramatic. You've got those high cumulonimbus clouds. You maybe have lightning going on, which you have to be careful about if you're shooting lightning, but if you know how to do it, it can be really, really dramatic. You have to be careful. Usually there's wind coming in, so you may want to stabilize things on a tripod. But shooting on the edge of things, on the edge of different kinds of weather, can be very, very good for your photography as well. So that's tip number 8. Now tip number 9, this really seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how often you look at a picture and whatever is being shot, whatever object is the subject of the photo, is dead center. It may work sometimes, but it's a lot more interesting if the object is maybe off to the side or a little bit lower or higher or whatever, but not so static. When you have a subject that is centered all the time, it looks really kind of static. So be aware that you can put things on the corners or on the edges a little bit, or use the rule of thirds. You know, you break up your screen into thirds, and you put something in one of those thirds. It can be very, very effective in making your photography even better than it is. And tip number 10, the final tip for today, another one that's really obvious, but you know something? Myself included, we don't do this enough. You got to shoot. You got to shoot, and shoot more. You've got to practice, practice, practice. And practice does make almost perfect anyway. But we've got to get out there with our cameras all the time. I've gotten into the practice of anytime I go out, I have my camera with me. Now, most of the time I don't use it, but every now and then something comes up or the light changes or something happens on the street or in the country, whatever, and you've got your camera and you're not left there saying, oh, gee, I wish I'd had my camera. I missed an incredible opportunity. Won't happen if you have your camera, okay? Especially if you go back to tip 1 and you know how to use your camera, okay? And if you know how to use your camera, then something won't happen and you'll be fumbling with it and saying, gee, how do I set the aperture? What do I do? If you know how to use your camera, if it's just an extension of you, then you can get the images that you want. So those are the top 10 tips for today on this beautiful spring morning by the lake. Now, there's a whole bunch more tips I could give you. In fact, I've got 5 more up on my website in my blog. So if you want to see those tips, those 5 extra tips, you can go to visart.ca and go to the blog page. Now that's visart.ca, visart.ca, and just click on blogs and you'll see the tips that I have there. And as a bonus, there's actually another tip, a bonus tip, a 16th tip, and it's specifically geared for urban and street photographers. It can apply to all photographers, but especially for urban and street photographers. So you might want to see that too. That's visart.ca. Okay, well, it's been fun. Hope you've enjoyed it. And a reminder, until next time, I'm Ray Scott, and it's not what you see, it's how you see it. See you soon.